Everybody, and let's get underway. Welcome everyone, and thanks very much for joining this event on hot zones, weapons transfers to the Israel-Palestine conflict, Myanmar, Sudan, and the latest arms trade treaty implications. For those who don't know me, my name is Hine-Wai and I represent Control Arms. Next week, Geneva will host the 10th Conference of States Parties to the Arms Trade Treaty, marking a crucial milestone for this international legal instrument. This year's conference occurs against the backdrop of an unprecedented global focus on conventional weapons transferred in violation of international law and the devastating impact that this has on civilians, as tragically evident in Gaza, Sudan, and Myanmar. These real-world examples underscore the profound impact that decisions made by licensing officials and governments can have on civilian lives, and should be the central focus of discussions at the 10th Conference of States Parties. For this webinar, as always, post questions in the chat function. We don't anticipate giving people the floor, and we will try to endeavour to get to respond to any questions. We hope that this webinar won't take any longer than 70 minutes. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by what is an impressive lineup of experts: John Chappell, Bushra, Khalidi, James Dong, Khristopher, Carlson, and Tove, Holmström. We are first going to receive an update on legal developments related to weapons transfers and the humanitarian situation in Gaza. As many of our audience will be aware, it was at this year's ATT working groups in February that the first ever formal discussion of a case of a compliance took place at an ATT meeting. That discussion was on transfers to the Israel-Palestine conflict. To get us underway, John Chappell, who is the Advocacy and Legal Advisor at CIVIC and based in the United States, is going to provide a recap on the standards to be applied to conventional weapons transfers by ATT states parties and non-states parties. And he's going to do it all within 4 minutes. So John, thanks very much for getting us underway, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hine-Wai, for having me, and thanks to all of my excellent co-panelists. So I'll start with a very quick acknowledgement of the fact that today it was reported that the official death count in Gaza has exceeded 40,000. It's almost certainly a significant undercount. And it seems like every day there are more and more indications of violations of international humanitarian law, also by arms transferring states, violations of national law and policy, but major arms sales continue, including, as an example, the approval just 2 days ago of $20 billion in arms sales from the United States to Israel. And so I'll run through very quickly in 4 minutes, hopefully, and less now, the major standards that apply here, starting, of course, with the Arms Trade Treaty, since that is kind of the focus of our discussion today. And Article 7 is the place to focus when it comes to international humanitarian law and international human rights law risks associated with conventional arms transfers. Article 7 requires certain assessments of risks associated with arms transfers, and also stipulates that an exporting state party to the Arms Trade Treaty will not authorize the export of arms if there's, quote, an overriding risk that the weapon will be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law or international human rights law. But, of course, there are plenty of states that are not parties to the Arms Trade Treaty, one of them being the country of which I am a national, the United States. And so in that case, we can look to relevant standards in customary international law. And one of those is drawn from the Common Article 1 of the four Geneva Conventions. And is also reflected in customary international law. This is what is often referred to as the Ensure Respect Clause. It's a clause that commits parties to the Geneva Conventions to ensure respect to the conventions and more broadly to international humanitarian law. This obligation to ensure respect extends not only to states that are parties to a particular conflict, but to all states. And states have to use their influence to the extent possible to stop violations of international humanitarian law. Of course, states that provide weapons are in a particularly important position to do this. And they have particular influence in assuring respect because they can withhold the means by which violations of international humanitarian law are committed. And the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, kind of the guardian of international humanitarian law, has interpreted the Ensure Respect Clause to mean that states are prohibited from transferring weapons to a party to an armed conflict when there's a clear risk that they'll contribute to the commission of international humanitarian law violations. There are other international law standards that deal with responsibility, whether of states or liability of individuals for atrocity crimes, namely state responsibility and aiding and abetting liability. I won't get into that in depth now, but that's a quick sketch of some of the international law standards that apply here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. And your quick sketch has indeed covered it all. And it's also important to remember the prohibitions that are set out in Article 6, and they set out that if a state has knowledge at the time of the transfer that the weapons could facilitate genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, then the transfer is prohibited from going ahead. But continuing with you, John, we're not going to cover all of the legal developments that have happened since this conflict started, but just turning really to recent legal developments related to weapons transfers to Israel. And the two that I would like to address have been, much more recent. And these are the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. So that's first of all the advisory opinion of the ICJ. And then the International Criminal Court's applications for arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Gallant, both of Israel, of course, concerning war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the territory of the state of Palestine. Concerning these two developments, what impact would we expect them to have, or they should have, on decisions to transfer weapons to Israel? So back to you, John.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you also for bringing up Article 6. I think I skipped over that bullet in my notes. So the ICJ advisory opinion, let's start there. And I think that one thing to understand about the ICJ advisory opinion as this beginning is that this is much broader than the conflict ongoing in Gaza today. And so this deals with the legality and permissibility of Israeli occupation more broadly. It deals with systemic discrimination. It deals with apartheid. And paragraph 279 of this advisory opinion deals with the how third-party states have responsibilities in light of the findings of the advisory opinion with regard to occupation. And so paragraph 279 finds that states must not render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. And that's a quote. So part of what is significant about this is that it is a broader finding and a broader obligation beyond the specific use of specific weapons and specific atrocity crimes, as an example, in the context of Gaza, I mean. And we've already seen that this has sparked a review of arms transfer policy in the United Kingdom under the new Labour government. And it should spark similar reviews in many countries, depending on how this finding fits in with domestic law and policy frameworks. But often the sorts of standards that exist in the arms transfer or the Arms Trade Treaty are also have similar standards in domestic arms transfer law and policy. On the ICC, the legal standard, the International Criminal Court, which is of course a criminal court that deals with atrocity crimes committed by individuals, has found that there is reasonable grounds to believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant bear responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. Again, that is the evidentiary, that is the standard from which states should proceed in assessing whether arms transfers to Israel should continue. And that baseline should be taken into account when risk assessments are conducted by governments. So how exactly that looks will depend on exactly what the standards are in each government. However, it is and should be and must be the starting point from here on out, in addition to what has been very extensive evidence of civilian harm and violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law carried out by Israeli security forces in Gaza and elsewhere. So that's what I've got for you today.
Thanks very much, John. And that's an excellent point that you end on, that there is in all of these developments, what they demonstrate is the extensive evidence of civilian harm, and that's certainly an important point to reiterate at this moment. So thank you very much. Next, we're going to come to our second speaker, and that is Bushra Khalidi, who is the humanitarian policy lead at Oxfam, and is based in Palestine. Bushra, where exactly in Palestine are you based?
I'm in the West Bank in Ramallah.
Okay, thanks very much. And I just want to add that this year at the ATT working groups held in February, we were fortunate to receive from Oxfam at that moment a presentation on the impact of the conflict on the civilian population in Gaza. And Bushra is going to update us on what's happened since the working groups in February. And she's going to look at, what has been the harm done to civilians, what has been the harm done to infrastructure, is aid entering Gaza, and are aid organisations able to access the affected populations. So, Bushra, thanks very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks for having me. I'm actually sad that I'm having to address the situation that continues to reach on a level of really unprecedented devastation. And I wish that I didn't have to present today. We're convening on the margins of this conference, and it's really important that we understand the consequences of continued transfer and use of weapons in this region. Israel's military activity in Gaza has led to its widespread destruction of its infrastructure, including homes, schools, hospitals, water facilities, shelters, refugee camps, mosques, churches, universities. Every aspect of life has been decimated in Gaza. And the indiscriminate nature of these bombings, combined with the apparent proportionate, harm inflicted on civilians, it's not only unacceptable, but it's deeply, deeply concerning to our broader humanity. The impact that this war has had on specifically children has been particularly horrific. And the reason why we mention children is because half of Gaza's population are children. Nearly 15,000 of them have been killed in the last 10 months. Thousands more have been maimed, losing limbs, or suffering life-altering injuries. Their small bodies are much more vulnerable to the blast effects of explosive weapons that we've seen used in Gaza, which throw them harder and faster, increasing the likelihood of severe deformities and injuries. But of course, the crisis goes beyond the immediate violence that we're seeing in the relentless airstrikes on across the Strip. Gaza is being systematically deprived of the most basic of necessities of life, like water, for example. Oxfam's recent report, Water War Crimes, highlighted the severity of this crisis. Israel's deliberate cutting of external water supplies, coupled with the systematic destruction of water facilities and the consistent obstruction of humanitarian aid, has reduced the amount of water available to just 4.74 liters per person a day. That is less than a third of the recommended minimum in emergencies and less than a single toilet flush. Israeli military attacks have damaged or destroyed 5 water and sanitation infrastructure sites every 3 days since the start of the war. Water production in Gaza has plummeted by 84%. And moreover, Israel has destroyed 70% of all sewage pumps, 100% of all wastewater treatment plants, and the main water quality testing laboratories in Gaza. So it's not just an infrastructure issue, it's a strategy to weaponize water, turning it into a tool of war. The impact of this on public health has been absolutely catastrophic, and there are no more words to describe what the public health situation is in Gaza. More than a quarter of its population has fallen severely ill from easily preventable diseases that is directly linked to the lack of clean water and sanitation. Hospitals, which should be sanctuaries for the sick and injured, have become battlegrounds and graveyards. The World Health Organization has warned of a looming polio outbreak with tens of thousands of children and vulnerable people at risk. Vaccines, critical medical supplies, and even the basic cold chain equipment needed to maintain these vaccines are either delayed or blocked from entering Gaza. The health system is on its knees. It cannot cope with the rising needs. And without a ceasefire and a halt to the bombardment, even the most urgent immunization drives will be rendered completely impossible, putting countless lives at further risk. The situation is not just a medical crisis, it's a moral one. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights had already warned of the heightened risk of atrocity crimes being committed in Gaza, calling on all states to act to prevent such crimes. Yet, the international community has largely remained passive, while the situation on the ground is only getting worse every single day. And we have to ask ourselves, how has the situation in Gaza reached this point? A significant factor is the continued transfer of weapons to Israel, which are used in ways that violate international humanitarian law. These weapons, supplied by states with the full knowledge of their potential use in civilian areas, have been instrumental in the destruction we're seeing today, and as our report on water and wastewater infrastructure shows. The use of explosive weapons in populated area has just caused absolute untold suffering, and it's just imperative that we reassess our role in the ongoing crisis. The Arms Trade Treaty was established to regulate the international trade of conventional arms, with a specific aim of preventing and eradicating the illicit trades in arms and ensuring that weapons don't contribute to human suffering. However, the situation in Gaza, but also the starkly highlights the gap between the treaty's intentions and the reality on the ground. States that continue to supply weapons to Israel, knowing they will be used in a manner that causes disproportionate harm to Israel, may be complicit in these violations. The international community has to take a stand. It's not enough to call for a ceasefire. It is not enough to condemn. We have to demand an immediate halt to all arms transfers to Israel until it can be guaranteed that these weapons are not going to be used against Palestinian civilians. And this includes not only conventional weapons, but also the parts and ammunition that enables their use. We must pressure governments to impose a comprehensive arms embargo to support a humanitarian arms embargo. Ensuring that weapons aren't continuing to fuel the violence across the occupied Palestinian territory.
Bushra, thanks very much. And you are really, speaking and telling us so very close to what is really a horrendous situation. One issue that I'd be grateful if you could touch upon, and that is, some time ago, there was much discussion about is humanitarian access actually getting into Gaza or not? And of course, this is, you know, from Geneva, this has been lost from headlines. What is the situation now? Is any assistance getting through, or is it a lost cause?
Well, I think the way you measure success of access is not through how many access points are open or how many trucks or how many tons of food is entering Gaza. It's by actually measuring the level of need and if that is being met or not. And from what I've described to you today, I'm telling you that the level of need is only getting worse every single day. And therefore, whatever access is provided, and it's extremely limited and extremely obstructed. And, you know, I would defer as well to our audience to make sure to have a look at our, every 2 weeks, we have a humanitarian access snapshot that looks at the last 2 weeks in our access. You know, there is no improvement. And I don't want to say a lost cause. I think it's about third states have their responsibilities and they need to abide by international law, and there needs to be accountability for the violations that have already occurred. It's only by continuing and enabling this cycle of impunity that we will, you know, we will not see any change. So we need accountability, we need investigations, and for those responsible for war crimes, and they must be held to account. And the normalization of this level of death and destruction and depravity is not just a threat to Palestinians, but to really humanity as a whole. We can't allow Gaza to become a testing ground for impunity.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Bushra, and your points are certainly very well understood. Thank you. There's been a question to John about what has initiated the UK review. John, do you want to respond to that now?
I'm happy to come back to it when we come to Q&A, but if you, or I can do it now.
If you would like to respond now, John, thanks very
Yeah,
much.
sorry. And someone flagged this for me. I think I misspoke when I was speaking about the UK review of arms transfer policy, which is ongoing now. And reportedly, the some new licenses for arms exports from the UK have been suspended, as is reported just in the last couple of weeks. But I did want to clarify that the ICJ opinion, advisory opinion, was not the direct impetus for the beginning of the review, but rather something that it is hoped will be taken into account as the review is ongoing. Yeah,
thanks very much, John. Thanks for that clarification. Now we're going to, you know, certainly Gaza and what is happening there and the impact of arms transfers would warrant a lot more of our time today, but we're going to move on to another context which you know, which hasn't been receiving the attention from the international community that it urgently demands, and that is Sudan. Last year, intense fighting broke out between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. And at the beginning of this month, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs was calling for urgent action from donors to prevent a widespread famine in Sudan. Unfortunately, famine has taken hold in Sudan. Today, we are joined by a long-time Controller Arms member and a member of the Board of Directors for the Assistance for Africa, and an individual who is from Sudan, and that is James Dong. James, could you please speak to us about what lies at the heart of this? What are the origins and reasons for this conflict? Over to you, James. James, you're muted.
Thank you very much. As introduced earlier, I'm Reverend James Ninrew Dong, the chair of SANSA. SANSA stands for South Sudan Action Network on Small Arms, and a member of Board of Director and founder of Assistant Mission for Africa, which is a member to SANSA, and also a chair of South Sudan and Sudan Religious Leaders Initiative for ending the war in Sudan. Really, the issue of Sudan came abruptly and caught everybody by surprise, because earlier we thought the SAF and the rapid response forces were friends. After the ending of war in South Sudan and after the independence of South Sudan, the rapid response force became redundant. And as a result, since they have been in war in South Sudan, defending Sudan, there has not been much activity for them, apart from occasionally intervening in Darfur and also fighting in Nuba Mountains. And for the Darfur, it has not been successful because of the presence of UNIMIS. But the two parties, which is the RSF and SAF, agreed to merge together and defend the Sudan. But of course, this agreement did not go very well, and they entered into loggerhead, which is trigger the war. Coming to what are the impacts of that war into the humanitarian situation, knowing that the war in Sudan, as described in so many platforms, first of all, is targeting infrastructure, and by both parties, the SAF bombing the country and bombing Khartoum and bombing residential area to flush out, in order to flush out the rapid response forces, and that impacted negatively on this population. And as a result, all livelihood was destroyed, the school was destroyed, homes were destroyed, worship places were destroyed, and people were forced to go out of Sudan in a massive number. If you know, the population of Sudan is had 47 million people. Out of that 47, 10 already are internally displaced, and 5 of that 10 are children. And that makes Sudan now become the worst country for children and the worst humanitarian place for every humanitarian workers to live in. 2 million of this have crossed to the neighboring country, of which South Sudan, where I'm currently, took a lion's share of that, because it includes South Sudanese who have been actually residing in Sudan after the 2013 war, now are forced to return home to Sudan, to South Sudan. And that's made it very difficult for the South Sudanese to cope with the current situation, and made, as you know, the border between Sudan and South Sudan is the largest in Africa, and that is not being monitored. And so the flow of arms between Sudan and South Sudan has been going on for centuries, and this is now being used by the armed forces and also the opposition from both countries to trade arms. And South Sudan become a logistic hub for illicit arms, and which goes to neighboring country. And as a result, the humanitarian situation in Sudan is indescribable. It's almost to the tune of what is happening in Gaza and Israel. That is becoming unlivable, and people are fleeing. And those numbers I said are changing by the hour, because people are still fleeing Sudan to other neighboring countries. Yes, I think the situation needs intervention. And today, they are supposed to meet in Geneva and agree on cessation of hostility. But I don't know the latest. The latest was that Sudan armed forces have not sent representative. I don't know whether that has changed or not. Thank you.
Sorry, James, that you're correct that those talks got underway yesterday in Geneva, and the government forces haven't turned up.
No.
Any final words from you, James, on the situation there?
Well, the final word is that, as you said earlier, Sudan war has not been given the deserved attention that they need. The Sudanese are really suffering very much. And you know, Sudan is surrounded by other countries that are not also in peace. Like if you go to Ethiopia, it's not in peace. If you go to South Sudan, it's not in peace. If you go to Chad, it's not in peace. So Libya is not in peace. So Sudan is really, the people in Sudan are squeezed in that area of Sudan, which is now becoming a hot spot. So I think it needs our attention, and especially humanitarian and the international community need to push very hard. The two parties, they must come into agreement, and they must come into cessation of hostility and ceasefire.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks very much, James. I think, you know, in both these conflicts, it's really children who are bearing the brunt of what is happening. And in Sudan, you know, not only is there, in both, there is famine, and there is mass movements of the population. And in Sudan, you know, we have to be mindful, you know, remember the impact that it is also having on the neighbouring countries. So thanks very much. We're now going to turn to Khristopher Carlson, who is a senior researcher and Sudan project coordinator with the Small Arms Survey. Khristopher, where are the weapons coming from that are fueling this conflict, and what weapons are being transferred to this context?
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, for having me here today, and happy to be here with these fabulous colleagues for the panel. I think it's a very important question, and I'll get to that in a moment, and talk about some of the inflows of weapons and where those weapons are coming from. I think it's also, prior to that, important to reflect a bit kind of on past proliferation of firearms and where Sudan was before the outbreak of this conflict, and kind of situate that and provide context to just how bad things are now as Sudan reaches, I think, a new level of not only demand for firearms, but certainly the supply of them into Sudan. And I think the point that James made there at the end is a very important one, and that is looking at the regional turmoil that is ongoing, not only in Sudan, but on its bordering states and neighboring states, Libya, Ethiopia, Chad, South Sudan, as these dynamics are also very important in considering the flow of weapons into Sudan, not only from afar, but from neighboring states as well. And so looking at Sudan's past, it's already, prior to this conflict, tremendously inundated with firearms. You have the conflict, of course, the two civil wars. You have the outbreak of the Darfuri conflict in the early 2000s, the resurgence of violence in the two areas of Blue Nile and South Kordofan, which coincided with new dynamics of arms proliferation that emerged in the post-2011 period following South Sudan's independence. In a 2000 publication of the Small Arms Survey, it was estimated that among civilians alone, there are nearly 3 million firearms in civilian possession. That's roughly 6.77 or so people per 100 already in possession of firearms prior to this conflict. And as some context, it's about 5 times more firearms that are in possession of the organized military forces in Sudan, which roughly are about 600,000 weapons. So, and this is second, the civilian holdings of firearms ranks second in the entire continent of Africa, second only to Sudan's northern neighbor Egypt, which has roughly 4 million civilian firearms. So already you're talking about a tremendous number of firearms already in circulation, and then these complications are exacerbated upon the outbreak of this conflict in April of 2023. And so you have a situation now where arms transfers into Sudan are not only supplying the principal belligerents in this conflict, the RSF and Sudanese armed forces, but also contribute to the further arming of civilians and the vast array of armed groups, militias, community-based armed factions across Sudan, whether linked to the RSF or SAF, or operating independently of either of those two groups. Where are current flows of weapons coming from? Reporting from the UN panel of experts, various Western and Arab media sources, as well as civil society organizations, including an excellent report recently published by Amnesty International in looking at weapons transfers into Sudan, identify a number of points of origin of arms to Sudan, as well as countries involved in facilitating the weapons transfer chain of those flows into Sudan. And from here, spreading out in the redistribution and retransfer of those weapons to the various parties involved in this conflict, but also to the other aforementioned groups that may or may not be directly involved in the main conflict between the two belligerent parties, but involved in more localized types of armed violence. From that public reporting in Sudan, these weapons range from small arms to heavy military equipment and large weapon systems. I won't get into the technicals of all of that, but it is quite a broad range of conventional weapons types that are flowing into Sudan, including multi-rocket launchers, unmanned aerial combat vehicles, and so on. Many of these weapons can be tracked back to a number of countries that are either manufacturers of these weapons or involved in facilitating their export directly to Sudan and the armed groups there, or are both manufacturers and exporters. Some of those countries include, as captured within the reporting, public reporting on the matter, include Turkey, Russia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, China, Serbia, and a number of other countries as well. And some of these countries being state parties to the Arms Trade Treaty, important to note. Once weapons are entering into Sudan and from those that are already in circulation, among the many challenges of controlling the spread and misuse of those weapons in the country is the sheer number of military actors involved and present in Sudan. And the composition of these groups that are engaged in the fighting further complicates the control or management or even tracking and monitoring of these weapons. Since the outbreak of the conflict last year, there's been an intense reliance on the recruitment of new fighters and commanders, which has had an effect on weakening, particularly, I think, for the RSF, or at least the weakening of any notion of one, a central command structure of that particular group. And the RSF is comprised of many parts, some of which may today act in sync to the RSF's military objectives and its war against SAF, while in other cases act to further its own self-interests and conduct offenses, forcibly displacing populations and immiserating populations and adversarial groups as it sees fit. And this is, in these instances, it's very de-linked. Those objectives may be very de-linked from the broader war between the two belligerent parties to whom the transfers of these weapons may be initially intended. The weapons entering Sudan do so through multiple routes. These routes include running through southern Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, as James had noted, as well as other weapons entering from the eastern side of the country in Eritrea and Ethiopia. Some air transfers of weapons into the region are alleged to have also traveled through other regional airports, including in Uganda and Rwanda. This is noteworthy in trying to look more broadly at regional strategies and trying to mitigate and curb the inflow of weapons as other countries are involved. On the matter of that broad regional strategy to curb the flow of those weapons into Sudan, it's also very difficult because of the nature and the networks of non-state groups that are present within the region. RSF is only one of many, with alliances and links to other networks and non-state groups across borders in Chad and particularly Libya, highlighting again the importance of trying to curb the multi-directional flows of weapons across borders. And so it's a matter of not only Sudan, of course, and the weapons that are going in there, but the weapons that are also intended for other groups within the region in those neighboring states adjacent to Sudan. On the second point, and that is the types of weapons. As mentioned, it's a broad range from small arms, of course, the ammunition for those types of weapons, and larger weapon systems. You have a lot of AK pattern rifles. These are more or less standard and ubiquitous across the region more generally. Shotguns, you have pistols, you have a lot of small arms types and varieties, and a lot of weapons that are newer weapons types, suggesting that these transfers are indeed happening within the last year into the beginning of this conflict from April of 2023.
Intervene with a
yes.
question, and that is like this is a region that's awash with weapons, and that is a very good point that you've made. It's not only countries that are directly transferring weapons into this country, but it's also that there are constant flows of weapons in this region, and then also the weapons that are held by civilians. Is it possible to say between the government forces and the RSF, if I've got the right acronym, which is the better armed side? Which has the newest technology in terms of weapons that they have?
I think certainly the RSF has gained an upper hand in terms of access to more sophisticated and newer weapons types. From social media, it's clear to see that a lot of the firearms that are in possession of RSF fighters are new. They're sophisticated weapons, and they're well beyond kind of the legacy types of weapons that we see also circulating in old AK type varieties and some of the older weapons that SAF has had in its stockpiles for quite some time.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Thanks for, very comprehensively outlining what the situation there. Now we're going to move along to the third context, and that is that we're covering today, and that is Myanmar. And last year, Control Arms and the margins of the 9th Conference of States Parties held a side event on examining arms transfers to Myanmar, and we held that side event in partnership with the European Union. This is another context which we are revisiting now and providing an update on in terms of what is happening and the gravity of the suffering being endured by parts of the population in Myanmar. So our final speaker today is Tove Holmström, who is a war crimes investigator and consultant and has worked extensively on Myanmar. Tove, since the military coup in February 2021, what has been happening in terms of arms transfers to Myanmar?
Thanks a lot, and thank you also for the invitation to join the talk and to speak about a conflict that quite often gets forgotten, I think, which is, of course, the conflict in Myanmar. I guess just to sort of take a step back and speak a little bit about what we know about arms transfers to Myanmar and why we know it, because I think the why makes Myanmar a pretty unique context. So as probably a lot of participants are aware, Myanmar has received a lot of attention within the UN. There's a UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar. There's been a fact-finding mission on Myanmar, and now there's the independent investigative mechanism on Myanmar, all reporting to the Human Rights Council. There's been a traditional focus on what companies are doing in Myanmar and how they're enabling various atrocity crimes. That has led to the publication of a public report in 2019 by the fact-finding mission that was listing hundreds of companies that were supplying various dual-use items and also weapons and, of course, other financial services to the junta. Myanmar is interesting because basically most of the economy is controlled by the military. That's why it's often called the khaki economy, because there's a lot of links with different military enterprises or senior leaders within the military that have been quite widely reported upon. I'd say prior to the coup already, there was a military takeover in 2021. There was a lot of leaks from within the military about various arms deals. And that has continued after the coup, because you have an increasing number of soldiers and high-ranking people either deserting or defecting to opposing forces, or to just staying in the military and leaking information. And so it's a very interesting context to work on as a war crimes investigator, because we see a lot of confidential documents that I think a lot of arms suppliers and states transferring weapons do not want for us to see. And it really shows this discrepancy between what states are reporting that they're transferring or not, and what we know that is actually ending up in the hands of the Myanmar military. I should also caveat that my work is principally focusing on what the military is obtaining, so I'm looking less at what some of the other EAOs, so the armed ethnic organizations, are getting their hands on. And I specifically look at things that are very difficult to divert. So I'm not looking at small arms that tend to, flood the country and flow around, but I'm looking at things that tend to be directly transferred from a country to the Myanmar military, whether that's fixed-wing aircraft or other maintenance and repair overhaul services, for example, or guided munitions for the aircraft. I guess quickly also to piggyback off what Khristopher was saying, I think it's important to speak a little bit about who is traditionally supplying the Myanmar military and how that has changed a little bit since the coup. I guess I'd start with the what. I mean, a lot of what's being transferred to Myanmar now is aircraft, so fixed-wing military aircraft. Increasingly so also aircraft that hasn't been designed to bomb various targets, but sort of military transport aircraft, also civilian airline aircraft, where basically the military removes the back doors and they push mortar projectiles or unguided ammunition out from the back of the airplane. There's been a lot of drones, including commercially available off-the-shelf type of drones that are then being weaponized to drop mortar projectiles used by various sides of the conflict. And Myanmar also, I should say, is very interesting because it has been such a heavily sanctioned country for a long time, including by the US and the European Union. The military successfully manufactures a wide range of weapons, so they are still receiving a fair bit of dual-use goods, especially electrical components for fuses that are then being used to manufacture unguided munitions for aircraft. By whom? I mean, you have three big suppliers, two of which remain quite important. You have China and Russia. I know that China is a state party, of course, to the ATT. To a lesser extent, India, Thailand, and Pakistan. Pakistan often being used as a proxy by some of the other arms suppliers. A fair bit of arms brokering and dual-use goods suppliers from Singapore. A lot of the supplies are sent directly to the Myanmar military, so that would be your Office of the Chief of Defense Industries or the Department of Procurement. What is, I think, quite interesting with Myanmar also is that they rely on really extensive network of arms brokers, some of which are based in Singapore. This has been widely documented also by UN and credible human rights organizations. To get to the question, and I'll try to be really brief, some changes since the military takeover in 2021. There have been a little bit less supplies from Russia. This is because Russia is needing their own weapons for the conflict in Ukraine. I should say that some of the weapons that Russia has previously sent to Myanmar have actually been shipped back to Russia and are being used in Ukraine. We've also seen the documented use of Myanmar-made mortar projectiles in Ukraine. So Myanmar is actually supplying some of the, I guess, pretty easy stuff to make to Russia that isn't being used in Ukraine. Some of the supplies that have predated the military coup in 2021 have continued. So two big suppliers would be China and India. Again, this we know because we have a lot of leaked data. We have a lot of human sources telling us that. I'd say significant evidence to show that this is the case. This would be particularly things that relate to aircraft and munitions used with aircraft. This is problematic, of course, because aircrafts are being increasingly used in the conflict. because the junta has, lost a lot of control, I'd say even effective control over the territory, they're using more and more airstrikes. And so we've been looking a lot at maintenance, repair, and overhaul services of the fixed-wing aircraft that have been supplied by some of the neighboring countries to the Myanmar junta. I guess I should say that, of course, attention at the UN continues. Looking at arms transfers to Myanmar and to known arms brokers, there was a notable report in 2023 by the UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar that was basically showing, based on leaked documents from the Ministry of Defense, all the deals that had been struck and all the stuff that had been shipped into Myanmar between the coup, so February 2021 and the end of 2022. After the report, from what I understand, there's been a mushrooming of new arms brokering companies in Myanmar because the old arms broker companies that were mentioned were sanctioned by a lot of authorities. There was a lot of crackdown by Singaporean authorities on the banking system, facilitating some of the arms transfers and also arms brokering networks that were operating out of Singapore. And I guess by way of conclusion, there's been a recent court order from South Africa, which is just, I think, dating a week back, that basically prohibits transfers of arms to Myanmar. So I think that's really interesting to flag. I mean, I guess I should say that, in the current context in Myanmar, I don't think you can transfer any conventional weapons that would not pose an overriding risk of being used for atrocity crimes. So I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tove. And that was a fascinating presentation. And I had no idea about Myanmar's weapons actually ending up in Russia. Last year, we very much focused on the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar's report, which named those countries that were transferring weapons to the Myanmar military and demonstrated how those weapons were being used to bomb civilians. This year's report is also worth looking at. It looks at the witch banks and the financial system that the Myanmar military is able to use in order to purchase weapons and other military equipment. Tove, I don't know if you want to say anything at this moment about the ongoing impact on the civilian population in Myanmar.
Yeah, I can. I don't think it's very different from what we've heard from other countries. I mean, I think, in Myanmar, what is principally being used is, they're waging war from the skies. So what you see used, as I mentioned already, is either combat aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles that, have been designed to drop weapons, or a lot of, civilian aircraft, like even French-made ATR aircraft that are being used. Basically, they remove the door and they push bombs from the back. I think there's been an increasing use of civilian or military transport airplanes for these kind of purposes because they can fly much longer. So essentially, instead of having to refuel every 2 hours, you send up, a Chinese Harbin Y-12 and it can just circulate for 8 hours and keep dropping mortar projectiles and unguided munitions. So there's been, again, for Myanmar, there's a lot of attention at the UN about the airstrikes because there's an increasing, I'd say even a dramatic rise in the use of airstrikes. Basically, the Myanmar Air Force has been involved in various conflicts since 2012, but what we see now is quite unprecedented. So we see this year, there was research that came out, let me just find the numbers, that said that between January and April, we see about 7 airstrikes per day. I should also say that the only party to the conflict that has access, the means and motives to use aircraft is the Myanmar Air Force. So again, if we see, airstrikes on schools or monasteries or hospitals or even camps for internally displaced people, which has been, was on the headlines last year, then, there's no doubt as to who committed those airstrikes. And, based on the pictures, we see fragments or remnants of munitions used. We can also say, whether those munitions were actually made in Myanmar because they make unguided munitions with the assistance of a certain state party to the ATT, or whether those munitions have been supplied, from that state party or from Russia. So I'd say, the impact is that you have airstrikes, you have a lot of nightly airstrikes, and so that there's this general sense of fear among the civilian population. And, I guess lastly, what we see, of course, the impact on children, because there's been heavy bombardments of various schools. They will bombard schools and then send down troops to, shoot heavy artillery or other light weapons. And that, of course, has the impact that children are scared to go to school or that schools are closing down. So I think the long-term impacts on access to education will be quite dramatic for a country that's already so impoverished as Myanmar.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tove. And you can see in all of these contexts that even if the war, that even if the fighting was to end tomorrow, the actual impacts of these different conflicts and what is happening will go on for a number of years to come. So we're going to end with a quick fire round, and that is I'm going to ask each participant in 2 minutes to set out what they would, what would be their message to next week's 10th Conference of States Parties to the Arms Trade Treaty. So this is 2 minutes each, and I'm going to take it, I'm going to go in reverse order. So Tove, it's back to you.
Great, okay, I'll try to be very short. I mean, just doing some research for the, the talk this afternoon. One of the questions that Google gives you when you start typing up accountability and the ATT is that why did the ATT fail? And I don't think we're quite there yet, but I mean, I think there's a general sense of lack of accountability. There's, not nearly enough focus as there should be on Article 6 and 7. Again, looking at Myanmar, I don't think you can transfer weapons at all without it being a violation of Article 6 and for sure not Article 7. There's, this general sense among civil society that there's no, I'm looking at countries that are transferring weapons that are state parties to the ATT, and they should not be transferring weapons to Myanmar because since 2018, at least, there's been, at the UN by credible organizations, information suggesting that these weapons will not be used in a way that respects Article 6. And so I really think that there's this lack of oversight that is very important, that should be discussed. I have the feeling that now it's just state parties or signatories that themselves assess, whether there will be overriding risks of atrocity crimes being committed with the weapons. It's a bit like the butcher judging the quality of his own meat. And so I really wish that there would be some kind of peer system or, when state parties start reversing or looking at their expert control processes, that there would be some form of oversight that would ensure accountability. Because now if I look to Myanmar and, the principal states supplying Myanmar, there's, there's absolutely no possibility of accountability. And I think that's really fueling the conflict also. So that would be my advice. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Tove. You're right that there is the ATT has the rules, but there is much more needed in the way of oversight. So now continuing the reverse order to you, Khristopher.
I think that in Sudan, it's important to support the establishment of an independent and hybrid monitoring mechanism that includes civil society organizations and international experts and other regional actors with a mandate to track and publicly report on arms flows into and within Sudan. And of course, this is not only a Sudan-specific type of mechanism that could be considered, but relevant, I think, to other contexts as well outside of East Africa and some of the other conflicts that are being discussed here. So a mechanism that goes beyond, something that goes beyond just the traditional government oversight, and by incorporating civil society organizations that have an intimate knowledge of local arms flows and the dynamics of weapons circulation, ensuring that the monitoring of weapons flows is both comprehensive and contextually relevant to what is going on in Sudan.
Thanks very much, Khristopher. And now we'll James, you were there at the beginning of the ATT negotiations, I understand. And, you, as I said before, you are a long-time member of Control Arms. What would be your message to next week's conference?
My message is very, very small, but very effective. Having a weapon without ammunition, that weapon turned into just a walking stick. So I think among all the other mechanisms that we want to strengthen, let's just cut the supply on arms that are going to the country. We surrender, yes, there are already enough arms in the country, but those arms need a constant supply of ammunition. So if the state party put pressure and close all the loopholes for supplying those ammunition, I think that is going to work. The second message is that this is an opportunity that the parties to the conflict are coming to Geneva. I think it's high time to make pressure for all of them to sign the cessation of hostility. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. And I will remember that short yet highly effective message of yours. Now, Bushra. Bushra, I know that you would have much to say to next week's conference, but what would be your key message to them?
I urge people to remember, first of all, the faces behind the numbers. The children who have lost their lives, the families that have been torn apart, the communities completely destroyed. From my perspective, the situation in Gaza really is a test for our collective humanity, and it's a test that we cannot afford to fail, not just for Gaza, but for Sudan, for Myanmar, and for other contexts as well. The continued transfer of weapons to Israel, knowing the devastation they cause, as I've described it earlier today, it's a real stain on our global conscience, and we have to act now to stop the violence and protect civilians and uphold the principles of international law that are here to protect us and protect innocent civilians. I could continue, but I think I'll stop here.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Bushra. You're absolutely right. It's not only a legal obligation, but it is a moral imperative on us all to address this situation. And, we will certainly take that message into the conference. And last but not least, the man who got us started and is now getting the last word, John, over to you.
Thank you. I'll close with the word complicity. When arms exporting states send weapons into contexts where they know or where there is a high risk that those weapons will be used to facilitate or carry out war crimes, crimes against humanity, acts of genocide. In each of those instances, individuals who knowingly contribute to those arms transfers are complicit, as are the countries that carry out the transfers. So that is a great moral weight, and one that I hope is considered and reckoned with in the events next week.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. And I think, that is a really important point because of what is at stake here, and to link that to the issue of complicity. So I want to, I really want to thank our speakers today for sharing their expertise and having done such an excellent job in a short amount of time on 3 contexts that are truly devastating. Originally, we had hoped to have this event in person at next week's conference, but we were unable to bring people for such an event to Geneva. But we nevertheless believe that, and it's also important to have voices from the ground speaking on these matters, and those who have a deep knowledge and understanding and have been following these issues for some time. So thanks again to each one of you. Next week's ATT Conference of States Parties, there will be much celebration of the successes and the accomplishments. However, the focus cannot solely be on these. Multilateralism is a process designed to bring all states and stakeholders together to tackle difficult and contentious challenges. The ATT was negotiated to address the human suffering caused by arms transfers that enable violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And as we've seen today, it's a range of states that are in violation of international law. It's ATT states parties, signatory states, and non-states parties, and these have to be addressed. As we're shown today in Gaza, Sudan, and Myanmar, arms are being transferred to these contexts in violation of international law and the ATT, and that this is causing both unnecessary and unacceptable human suffering. And these and other cases demand a response from next week's conference. Control Arms will continue to engage with delegations on these critical issues next week. And once again, thanks very much to our experts today who we hope to stay in contact with. Finally, I wish to thank everyone for joining us, and I hope that this has been useful and has once again underlined the gravity of the situation that we face. Thanks very much, everybody, and I wish you a successful continuation of your day. Thanks, everyone. Bye.